Imagine building your nation's entire identity around, well, a catastrophic diplomatic failure where you flayed the daughter of your only ally.
Right, which is just, it's an incredibly intense way to start a story.
It really is. I mean, that is essentially the origin story of the most powerful empire Mesoamerica had ever seen.
Yeah.
Usually, like, when we look at a modern national flag, there is this expectation of clean, abstract symbolism, you know?
Absolutely. You see some stripes, maybe a star, and it all translates to these tidy little boxes of noble ideals.
Right, like red for courage, white for peace, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
But then you look at the flag of modern Mexico, and that tidy system is just completely shattered. You are looking at a visceral, bleeding landscape.
It's so striking.
It really is. It's a golden eagle perched on a prickly pear cactus in the middle of a swampy lake with a rattlesnake caught in its beak.
It completely refuses to be abstract.
Yeah.
It is, I mean, absolute definition of a dramatic, hyper-specific historical anchor.
Yes. And what is so incredible is that this image, which represents over 100 million people today, traces its origins back to this band of ragged outcasts.
It's an amazing journey.
So welcome to the deep dive. Today, our mission for you is to unpack a towering stack of sources.
A very tall stack.
Yeah, we're pulling from archaeological data, indigenous codices like the Codex Mendoza and the Florentine Codex, and first-hand accounts from the Spanish conquest.
All of which have their own biases, of course.
Right, definitely. So our goal is to dissect the central historical tension of the Aztec Empire, or, well, more accurately, the Triple Alliance.
Yeah, that's an important distinction to make early on.
Right. So we want to know, how did a tribe of nomadic mercenaries gain power so rapidly? How did they maintain their grip on millions of people? And, what truly caused their spectacular tragic collapse?
And to do that justice, we're going to be looking at this through two distinct lenses today. Because you really cannot understand the Aztec Empire without wrestling with its dual nature.
Very true.
So I will be taking the institutional lens. I want us to look past the mythology, to examine the raw geopolitical machinery,
The nuts and bolts.
Exactly. The institutional structures, the economics, the taxation, and the brilliantly and brutal, frankly, political strategies that actually ran the empire.
Because empires aren't just built on beliefs, right?
Right. They're built on bureaucracy and statecraft.
And I will be taking the cultural lens. I want to look at the vivid legacy, the intense mythology, the family dynamics, and the deeply religious worldview of the Mexica people.
Which is fascinating in its own right.
It really is, because looking through the native codices, my takeaway is that you just cannot separate their politics from their cosmology.
Yeah, they are completely intertwined.
If you want to understand how they conquered their world, you have to understand how terrified they were of the universe ending.
That existential dread is key. But let's start at the absolute bottom of the food chain then.
Let's do it.
Because to understand how this empire fell in 1521, you first have to understand how spectacularly unlikely their rise was.
Oh, it makes no sense on paper.
None at all. When the people we call the Aztecs entered the historical stage, they were not the ordained kings in golden feathers we picture today.
Far from it. The people we are focusing on, specifically the Nahua-speaking Mexica, were originally hunter-gatherers.
Right.
The codices describe them descending from Chichimeca peoples migrating from the north. They claimed a mythical homeland called Aztlan, which roughly translates to the place of herons.
Which is often described as a marshy island in a lake, right?
Exactly. Though other sources refer to their origin point as Chicamostoc, the Seven Caves.
Right, there's some variation there.
The legend basically says they were driven to migrate by their patron god, Huitzilopochtli. And this journey wasn't like a quick hike.
No, not at all.
It was a grueling, multi-generational migration led by priests. They were constantly stopping to plant crops, performing rituals, and then just moving again.
And the timeline puts their arrival in the Central Valley of Mexico right around the mid-13th century, so roughly 1250 CE.
Okay.
But here's where the mythology violently collides with geopolitical reality. When the Mexica finally wandered into the Valley of Mexico, they were not stepping into some empty promised land.
Yeah, it was packed.
It was incredibly crowded. They were walking into a highly developed, heavily militarized political gridlock.
Yeah, I was looking at the topographical maps of the valley from that era, and it is a fascinating ecosystem.
It's unique.
It's an endorheic basin, meaning it has no natural outflow for water, and it's surrounded by these towering volcanic mountains.
Yeah, it just traps everything inside.
And right in the center was this massive interconnected system of 5 lakes. It was fertile, but the water in the lowest lakes was incredibly salty and brackish.
And crucially, every inch of the good agricultural land was already spoken for.
Right.
There were already some 40 different city-states or altepetl established around those lakes. The Mexico were the very last Nahua migrants to arrive.
So they were basically the last ones to the party.
Exactly. They had no wealth, no land, and zero political standing. They were, for all practical purposes, unwanted refugees.
Which meant they had to survive by doing what scrappy, desperate newcomers do, right? They became mercenaries, hired muscle for the established lords.
Yeah, it was pragmatism born of desperation.
Yeah.
I mean, they carried a fierce military tradition from their nomadic days, so they offered their services to the strongest players in the valley.
Makes sense.
And eventually they ended up working as vassals for a powerful city-state called Culhuacan.
Okay, and this brings us to the first major turning point we really need to unpack for you.
Which is a big one.
So the Mexicans are fighting as mercenaries for Culhuacan. They are highly effective, so the ruler of Culhuacan decides to reward them, or, more likely, bind them closer as loyal subjects.
Right, keeping them on a leash.
Exactly. And he does this by offering his own daughter to their chieftain.
Which was a very standard Mesoamerican diplomatic maneuver. You marry a royal daughter into a subordinate tribe to legitimize their leadership.
Right.
You infuse them with royal blood, and you ensure they remain your attack dogs.
It's the ultimate prize.
Mm-hmm.
But the Mexicans do not consummate a royal marriage.
No, they do not.
According to their own mythological accounts, their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, commands them to honor this princess in a wildly different way.
In a very different way.
Instead of marrying her, they sacrifice her on an altar. And they don't stop there. They flay her skin to honor the god Chapultepec, the deity of agricultural renewal and rejuvenation.
And we should note the symbolism of Chapultepec involves a priest wearing the flayed skin of a sacrificial victim.
Right, which is just a horrifying image.
It is, but it represented a seed shedding its outer husk to bring forth new green life. It was deeply symbolic.
So the ruler of Culhuacan is invited to the Mexica camp. He thinks he is attending a wedding feast or maybe a coronation ceremony for his daughter.
He's expecting a celebration.
He walks into the temple, the incense is burning, it's dark, and as his eyes adjust, he sees a Mexica priest dancing, and the priest is wearing his daughter's skin.
I mean, geopolitically speaking, it is an absolute catastrophe.
I cannot fathom the political miscalculation here. It is like being a desperate startup, finally getting the biggest angel investor in the valley to back you, and at the signing dinner, you physically assault them.
That's actually a great analogy.
You have completely alienated the only ally you have.
You really have. I look at that event not just as religious fervor, but as a deliberate, albeit chaotic, declaration of radical independence.
Oh, you think it was intentional?
I think they were tired of being vassals. But the response from Culhuacan was, understandably, immediate and violent.
Yeah, the ruler summoned his army to wipe them out.
Exactly. The Mexico were driven out by force, running for their lives. They were chased out of the habitable lands entirely and pushed into the infertile, salty, marshy swamps in the middle of Lake Texcoco.
Basically a death sentence.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Nobody wanted this land. It was considered uninhabitable because you couldn't grow crops in the saline mud.
But the Mexica codices flip this moment of near extinction into a moment of divine providence.
They spin it beautifully.
They really do. They are starving in the swamp, surrounded by enemies on the mainland. And there, in the year 1325 CE, they see the omen. The eagle perched on a nopal cactus growing out of a stone.
The image on the flag.
Yes. They take this as the sign from Huitzilopochtli that they have found their permanent home. They drive stakes into the mud, and they found their city, Tenochtitlan.
And while the omen makes for great national mythos, the geographic reality of that swamp is what actually saved them.
How so?
Well, yes, they were driven there to die. But as archaeologists have pointed out, the limited access to this island provided an impenetrable natural moat.
Oh, that makes sense.
The armies of the mainland city-states couldn't easily march on them. The mud and the water protected them while they were vulnerable.
But how do you feed a city in a salty swamp? I mean, this is where I am just blown away by their engineering. They didn't just survive. They terraformed the lake.
Yeah, you're talking about the Chinampas.
Yes, the floating gardens. Though floating is a bit of a misnomer, isn't it?
It is. They didn't actually float.
The listeners really should understand how mechanically brilliant this was. They would drive massive wooden stakes into the shallow lake bed to form rectangular enclosures.
Right.
Then they wove reeds and branches between the stakes like a giant basket. They filled these enclosures with decaying vegetation and dredged up this nutrient-rich mud from the bottom of the lake.
It was incredibly labor-intensive.
And to anchor the whole thing, they planted ahuehuete willow trees at the corners, whose dense root systems would grow down and hold the artificial island together.
It really was a highly efficient form of agriculture. A single chinampa could yield up to 4 crops a year because the soil was constantly irrigated from below.
Wow, 4 crops a year.
Yeah, it provided the caloric baseline they needed to grow their population.
But even with Tenochtitlan growing, they were still subordinates. They were still paying heavy tribute,
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
They survived this early period by pivoting to a new overlord, the powerful Aztec Empire centered in the city of Azcapotzalco, ruled by this formidable king named Nezahualcoyotl.
Tetzcoco was basically the supreme strongman of the valley. For decades, the Mexica served as his elite shock troops.
Back to being mercenaries.
Exactly. They helped him conquer rival cities, and in return, they received a portion of the tribute and his protection.
And they learned from their disaster with Culhuacan, didn't they?
They did.
In 1372, they successfully petitioned another royal house and managed to get a legitimate prince, Acamapicli, enthroned as their first true Tlatoani, or ruler.
Right. They finally secured a seat at the regional political table.
But being a prized attack dog is not the same as being the master.
No, it is not. Which brings us to the critical geopolitical rupture. How does a mercenary state break the system that employs them?
You wait for a structural weakness.
Precisely. In 1426, the Tepanec king, Tezozomoc, dies after a very long reign. And whenever a centralized strongman dies in a fragmented political landscape, you get a succession crisis.
The ultimate power vacuum.
Exactly. Tezozomoc had chosen a preferred heir, a son named Tayaha, but another son, Maxla, usurped the throne.
And Maxla was bad news.
He was paranoid and utterly ruthless. To secure his illegitimate rule, he immediately began purging anyone whose loyalty was questionable.
Oh, wow.
This included the Mexican ruler at the time, Chimalpopoca. The sources strongly suggest Maxla had him assassinated.
Maxla was making enemies everywhere. He also went after the neighboring Acolua city of Texcoco, murdering their king and driving the young heir, Nezahualcoyotl, into exile in the mountains.
Right. Maxla severely overplayed his hand. By using blunt force to demand submission, he basically created a coalition of the resentful.
Right.
The New Mexico ruler, Itzcoatl, stepped into this volatile situation. Maxla demanded higher tribute from Tenochtitlan and blockaded the island to starve them into submission.
But Itzcoatl did not submit.
He couldn't. Submission meant slow strangulation. Instead, Itzcoatl aligned with the exiled Texcocan prince, Nezahualcoyotl, and a dissident faction within the Tepanec Empire itself, the city of Talcapan.
An alliance of convenience.
Exactly. Together, they initiated a full-blown civil war against Azcapotzalco.
The war is brutal, but by 1428, this coalition absolutely crushes Maxla. They sack Azcapotzalco.
A total victory.
And from the ashes of that victory, they formalize their military pact. This is the moment the Aztec Empire as we know it is actually born. The Triple Alliance. Tenochtitlan, Texcoco, and Tlacopan.
Let's break down the mechanics of this alliance, because it is a masterclass in statecraft.
Yeah, lay it out for us.
It wasn't just a handshake agreement. It was a formal mathematical structure designed to prevent another hegemon like Maxla from ever rising again.
Right.
They agreed to cooperate in all future wars of conquest, and they codified exactly how the spoils of war would be divided.
The 2-2-1 split.
Exactly. For every 5 parts of tribute extracted from a conquered province, Tenochtitlan took 2 parts, Texcoco took 2 parts, and Tlacopan, as the junior partner, took 1 part.
Very structured.
Yes. They also elevated the kings of these 3 cities above all others. They created the title Huey Tlatoani, meaning great speaker, placing them legally and symbolically at the apex of the valley's hierarchy.
Okay, here is where my lens comes into play, because the psychological whiplash here is just staggering.
It really is.
In a single generation, the Mexicas go from being swamp-dwelling mercenaries paying tribute to Azcapotzalco to being the imperial overlords demanding it.
It's an unprecedented pivot.
And the architects of this pivot were family Itzcoatl and his 2 brilliant nephews, Moctezuma and Tlacopan.
Right.
But my overarching question when reading the Codex is like, how does a society mentally justify that pivot. You don't just wake up one day and decide you have a divine mandate to conquer the world.
You are absolutely right. You don't. You have to engineer that mandate.
They sack
You have
her.
to deliberately construct an ideology of supremacy, and you cannot do that if the existing historical records contradict your new narrative.
Which brings us to Tlacaelel.
Yes.
I mean, he is the most fascinating, shadowy figure in this entire deep dive. He wasn't the emperor, but he was the architect of the empire's soul.
He really was. He held a newly created office, the Chapultepec.
Which translates to female snake, right?
Right, which reflects the Nahua belief in dualistic balance. The Huaytlatoani handled the masculine external affairs, so war, conquest, and diplomacy.
Okay.
Tlacaelel, as the Quetzalcoatl, handled the feminine internal affairs, domestic governance, the administration of Tenochtitlan, the judiciary, and crucially, state ideology.
He was essentially a prime minister, a viceroy, and a high priest all rolled into one.
Basically, yes. And his first major act of ideological engineering, he burned the books.
Yes. The native histories, the painted codices of the conquered peoples, and even their own older records. He ordered them all gathered and burned.
A complete erasure.
The justification given was that they contained lies and that it wasn't wise for the common people to know the paintings.
It was an act of pure, calculated propaganda. By destroying the historical record, Tlacaelel created a blank slate.
And then he sold it.
Exactly. He rewrote history to place the Mexica at the absolute center of the cosmos, elevating their patron god Huitzilopochtli to the supreme tier of the pantheon.
We really have to dive into that cosmology because it explains the machinery of their expansion.
It does.
The Aztec worldview was defined by an overarching, terrifying fragility. They believed in a concept called Ollantaytamtla, the sun of movement.
Right?
According to their mythology, carved into the famous sunstone, the universe had already been created and violently destroyed 4 times before.
By jaguars, floods, things like that.
Right. By jaguars, by hurricanes, by rains of fire, and by floods.
And they believed they were living in the 5th and final cosmic age.
And this final age was constantly teetering on the brink of annihilation. To keep the sun moving across the sky, to prevent the stars, which they viewed as demonic entities called the Tzitzimime, from descending and devouring humanity, the gods required sustenance.
They needed fuel.
Exactly. Fighting the darkness took energy, and the ultimate energy, the sacred life force, or Teotl, was contained in human blood. They called it Nezahualcoyotl, the precious water.
So Tlacaelel aligns this cosmological dread perfectly with the geopolitical need for imperial expansion.
It's a perfect fit.
He wove the religious duty of cosmic salvation into the military necessity of conquest. The Templo Mayor in the center of Tenochtitlan wasn't just a building, they viewed it as the literal center of the universe, the axis mundi.
And the scale of the rituals performed there is just hard to comprehend.
It's staggering.
When they dedicated the massive expansion of the Templo Mayor in 1487 under the ruler Ahuitzotl, indigenous accounts suggest they sacrificed up to 20,000 captives over 4 days.
20,000.
Priests working in shifts, 4 lines of captives stretching down the causeways out of the city. It's almost unimaginable.
Which leads us to the most debated institution of Tlacaelel's reforms. The Flower Wars, or Nezahualcoyotl.
Right. Now, these were not wars of conquest. They were highly ritualized, prearranged battles.
Like a tournament, almost.
Yeah, the Triple Alliance and their rivals, most notably the Tlaxcalans, would agree on a specific time and place to fight. The goal wasn't to capture territory or slaughter the enemy on the field. The sole objective was to capture elite warriors alive.
Taking a captive alive was the supreme military honor. As the historical accounts describe, Aztec weaponry heavily favored the Micafudal.
Oh, that weapon is terrifying.
It really is. This was a wooden club embedded with tightly spaced razor-sharp obsidian blades. And obsidian can be nabbed to an edge sharper than modern surgical steel.
Wow.
But the weapon was designed to maim, to shatter knees and incapacitate, rather than to deal a lethal thrusting blow like a European sword.
Because you needed them alive. Once captured, the warrior was brought back to Tenochtitlan. The ritual was deeply theatrical.
Yes, very public.
The captive was led up the steep steps of the pyramid, laid backward across a convex sacrificial stone to thrust their chest upward, and a priest would use a flint knife to open the chest, extract the beating heart, and offer it to the sun.
It was an industrialized system of biological harvesting.
To keep the universe from collapsing.
Well, I am going to stop you there because while the religious framing is vivid, we really have to analyze who actually benefited from this system. Tlacaelel's reforms, particularly the Flower Wars, were a masterclass in cynical, state-sponsored social control.
Wait, you think the religion was just a cover story?
I think the elite weaponized the religion for incredibly practical institutional purposes. Look at the mechanics.
Let's hear it.
First, the Flower Wars provided constant, rigorous military training against seasoned opponents without the logistical nightmare of sending armies hundreds of miles away. It kept the Triple Alliance military sharp.
Okay, that makes tactical sense.
Second, it was an instrument of psychological terror. It constantly bled their neighbors, keeping them in a state of perpetual fear and attrition, unable to build up a large enough force to challenge Tenochtitlan.
I take your point on the military utility, I really do. But I think calling it cynical dismisses the genuine apocalyptic dread of the Nahua worldview.
How so?
You cannot separate their politics from their environmental trauma. Look at the mid-15th century. During the reign of Moctezuma I, the Valley of Mexico was hit by a devastating drought from 1450 to 1454.
Ah, the year one rabbit famine.
Exactly. 4 years of failed crops. It was an absolute catastrophe. The lake shrank, the crops withered. People were literally selling their children into slavery to the coastal tribes just for a handful of maize.
It was a horrific time.
When you are an agricultural society and it doesn't rain for 4 years, you don't think, oh, we're experiencing a cyclical El Niño event. You genuinely believe the gods have abandoned you. You believe the sun is dying.
Right.
The flower wars and the massive escalation and sacrifice were born out of that trauma. In their minds, they were performing an act of desperate cosmic salvation.
I do not deny the psychological reality of the famine. The terror was very real. But look at how the institutions responded.
Okay.
The elites didn't sacrifice themselves to save the sun, did they?
No, they did not.
What Tlacaelel and the ruling class did was take that very real existential terror and institutionalize it. They built a system where the cure for the drought mass human sacrifice just happened to require a massive, aggressively expanding military state.
Convenient for the state, yes.
Very. Furthermore, it served a vital internal function: social mobility.
You mean the Quapili class?
Precisely. Aztec society was strictly stratified between the hereditary nobles, the Pipiltin, and the commoners, the Nezahualcoyotl.
Right.
But a commoner who captured enough enemies alive on the battlefield could be elevated to a lesser nobility rank, the Quapili. They were granted land, the right to wear cotton, and exemption from tribute.
A huge incentive.
The state incentivized its poorest citizens to become ferocious shock troops by offering them the only ticket out of poverty, while simultaneously using those captives to terrify foreign rivals. It is brilliant, terrifying statecraft.
It was a feedback loop. The religion justified the empire's expansion, and the empire's expansion fed the religion.
Exactly.
And regardless of whether it was driven by cosmic devotion or political calculation, the system worked with terrifying efficiency.
Which brings us to the apex of the empire's power. How does this machinery of war and sacrifice translate into everyday administration and wealth? Because you really cannot govern millions of people with obsidian clubs alone.
No, you can't. And the wealth is what always stands out to me. By the late 15th century, under rulers like Nezahualcoyotl and Huitzo, the Triple Alliance had exploded far beyond the Valley of Mexico.
They expanded rapidly.
They conquered down to the Gulf Coast, into the southern highlands of Oaxaca, and over to the Pacific. We are talking about 38 tributary provinces, covering roughly 135,000 square kilometers and dominating an estimated 5 to 6 million people.
And managing that requires a massive, complex bureaucracy. This is where we need to understand the role of the Calpics, the imperial tribute collectors.
If you look at the Codex Mendoza, which is essentially a visual ledger of the empire's tax demands, the sheer volume of goods flowing into Tenochtitlan is staggering.
It's basically a giant spreadsheet.
Yeah, exactly. The provinces were required to send tribute every 80 days or every 6 months, depending on the goods.
And what were they demanding, specifically?
Everything of value. Bales of tightly woven cotton mantles, warrior costumes decorated with brilliant green quetzal feathers, jaguar skins, jade beads, rubber balls for the ritual games, liquid amber, and massive quantities of gold dust.
Incredible wealth.
And crucially, millions of cacao beans. Cacao was so valuable it actually functioned as the primary currency in the markets.
The economy was so sophisticated that they actually had a problem with counterfeiting.
Wait, really? With cacao beans?
Yes. People would hollow out cacao beans and fill them with dirt or clay to pass them off in the markets.
That is amazing. And speaking of the markets, the economic integration was centered at Tlatelolco. Tlatelolco was originally a sister city on the island that Tenochtitlan eventually absorbed.
Right.
Its market was the beating heart of Mesoamerica.
Yeah.
The Spanish chronicler Bernal Diaz del Castillo wrote that they were just astounded by it. Upwards of 50,000 visitors daily.
50,000 people.
Yeah, it was highly regulated, divided into specific streets for specific goods. So you had herbalists here, feather workers there, slave traders in another section.
And to protect and expand this massive trade network, the state relied on a very unique institution, the Pocheca.
Oh, I love the Pocheca. They were basically a hybrid of elite merchants and the CIA.
That is actually a very apt comparison. The Pocheca were a hereditary guild of long-distance merchants. They had their own internal courts, their own gods, and they were forbidden from showing off their wealth to avoid angering the nobility.
Very secretive.
Very. They would mount massive expeditions, carrying goods far beyond the borders of the empire into hostile territory. But they were also the eyes and ears of the state.
They were gathering intelligence, mapping out routes, taking note of a rival city's defenses, their wealth, the strength of their garrisons.
Exactly. And they served as a geopolitical tripwire.
How so?
If a Pocheca caravan was attacked or denied entry into a foreign city, the Triple Alliance used it as a casus belli, a formal justification to declare war. You attacked our merchants, now the armies of the Great Speaker are coming.
Wow. But on the domestic side, the social fabric of the capital itself was incredibly organized. It wasn't just a chaotic mob of warriors. The city was organized around the Calpulli system.
Let's explain the Calpulli, because it is the fundamental building block of Aztec society. A Calpulli was essentially a neighborhood ward or an extended clan group.
And it managed almost every aspect of daily life. The Calpulli owned the agricultural land collectively and distributed it to individual families to farm.
Right.
When the state demanded tax in the form of labor, which they called codaquip, it was the Calpulli leaders who organized the work gangs to build aqueducts or repair temples.
It was very decentralized administration.
And when the empire went to war, each Calpulli fielded its own military unit, marching under its own unique banner.
But perhaps their most impressive function was educational.
Yes. The Aztecs instituted universal, mandatory education for all children, regardless of class or gender.
Which is an incredibly progressive concept for the 15th century.
It really is. Every Calpulli had a school for commoner children called the Telpocalli. Here, they learned civic duties, history, trades, and basic military skills for the boys.
And the nobility, where did they go?
The noble children, and a select few highly gifted commoners, mind you, went to the Kalmakak. This was the elite academy attached to the major temples.
Very exclusive.
Very. And the training there was brutal and rigorous. They learned the complex calendar system, the reading of painted codices, advanced rhetoric, poetry, theology.
The future leaders.
Exactly. They were trained to be the future priests, judges, and administrators of the empire, and they were subjected to intense fasting and self-mortification to build discipline.
Which highlights that this was a society governed by complex jurisprudence, not just arbitrary violence. In the allied city of Texcoco, the famous ruler Nezahualcoyotl, who was celebrated as a poet and a philosopher king, instituted a massive 80-law legal code.
The poet king had a harsh legal code.
Incredibly harsh. It established a formal hierarchy of courts, including appellate courts and a supreme court of nobles.
Wow, an appellate system.
Yes. It dictated severe, often capital punishments for theft, murder, adultery, and even public drunkenness.
Really? For drunkenness?
Oh, yeah. And if a noble was caught being corrupt, the punishment was often worse than for a commoner, because they were expected to be the moral pillar of society.
Yeah.
The empire relied on this strict framework of social control as much as it relied on the military.
So listening to this, you are probably picturing an unstoppable, fiercely disciplined, highly educated military machine backed by a terrifying religious mandate and endless wealth.
A juggernaut.
Which naturally begs the question, was there anyone they couldn't beat? Did this machine have a limit?
It absolutely had a limit.
Right, yeah.
And examining that limit exposes the geographic and tactical flaws in the Aztec military apparatus.
Okay, let's look at that.
To the west of the Valley of Mexico, in modern-day Michoacan, sat the Purepecha Empire.
The Purepecha, they rarely get the historical spotlight they deserve.
They really don't, but they were the anvil the Aztec hammer shattered against. The Purepecha were a highly centralized state, governed from their capital of Tzintzuntzan.
Okay.
In 1479, the Aztec Emperor Nezahualcoyotl decided to conquer them to secure the western frontier. He marched a massive army of some 32,000 elite Triple Alliance soldiers across the border.
And what happened?
It was an absolute slaughter. but not in the Aztecs' favor.
Oh, wow.
The Purepecha were ready. They met the Aztec force with an army of 50,000 soldiers. But the crucial difference was metallurgy.
Ah, technology.
Yes, the Purepecha had advanced copper smelting technology. They wielded copper asses and copper-tipped spears, whereas the Aztecs relied primarily on wood and obsidian.
The obsidian was sharper but brittle. It shatters against metal.
Exactly. The Purepecha utterly crushed the Aztec army. Historical estimates suggest over 90% of the Aztec force was killed or captured.
90%.
Nezahualcoyotl himself was badly wounded in the leg and barely escaped with a fraction of his men.
That is a staggering defeat.
It profoundly altered their geopolitical strategy. The Aztecs never engaged the Purepecha in a major pitched battle again.
So they just left them alone.
Well, they had to militarize the border. They built massive fortresses like Otsoma, which sat on a mountain ridge surrounded by sheer drops just to hold the line against Purepecha incursions.
Wow.
It proved that away from their logistical base in the valley, against a centralized state with equal organization and better metallurgy, the Aztec military could be broken.
Wow. So they hit a hard wall in the West. But as we move into the final phase of their history, we see that while the Purepecha checked their physical expansion, the fatal threat to the Aztec Empire wasn't sitting outside its borders.
No, it was internal.
The real threat was baking inside the empire itself. By the time Moctezuma II takes power in 1502, the empire looks like it is at the absolute zenith of its glory. But structurally, it is becoming brittle and hollow at its core.
This is the second major turning point we need to analyze: the reign of Moctezuma II and the catastrophic collapse.
Moctezuma II is a complex, often misunderstood figure.
Very much so. He inherits this massive, wealthy machine, but he spends his reign trying to fundamentally change how it operates. He wanted to aggressively centralize power.
The codices show him purging the government almost immediately upon taking the throne, right?
He did. He dismissed or executed many of the veteran administrators and generals left over from his predecessor, Nezahualcoyotl.
Out with the old guard.
Exactly. More importantly, he abolished the privileges of the Quapili class, that vital pathway we talked about for commoners to rise to nobility through military valor.
So he closed the door on social mobility.
He decreed that only those of pure noble blood could serve in his inner circle or hold high office.
He was pulling up the ladder, he was making the social system more rigid, alienating the very warriors who built the empire right at the moment when he needed the system to be flexible.
Exactly.
Because in 1519, an unprecedented black swan event arrives on the Gulf Coast. Hernán Cortés and a few hundred Spanish conquistadors.
Now, this is where we have to completely dismantle one of the most persistent, simplistic historical myths out there.
Let's do it.
The narrative that a few hundred Spaniards with some horses and primitive firearms conquered an empire of millions, all by themselves, through sheer technological superiority.
Right, the steel and gunpowder myth.
Technology played a role, certainly. Steel swords, armor, and horses are effective on a battlefield. But the structural failure of the Aztec Empire is what actually destroyed it.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Let's connect this back to what we discussed earlier about the Triple Alliance being a hegemonic confederation rather than a territorial empire like the Romans.
Right, they didn't build roads or assimilate cultures, they operated a massive protection racket. Pay us tribute or we burn your city.
Exactly. Because they ruled by extortion and the threat of periodic violence, they did not have loyal subjects. They had a vast population of heavily taxed, deeply resentful enemies living inside their own borders.
And the most pivotal of these enemies were the Tlaxcalans.
The Tlaxcalans are the key to the conquest. Moctezuma and his successors had intentionally avoided conquering Tlaxcala outright.
Instead, they encircled it.
Yes. They cut off Tlaxcalan trade routes, denying them access to coastal salt and cotton, and subjected them to decades of the exhausting attrition of the Flower Wars.
So when Cortés marches inland, he fights the Tlaxcalans first. The Spanish barely survive. They're almost wiped out.
It was a very close call for them.
But then the Tlaxcalan leadership realizes something crucial. They don't see Cortés as a foreign god or a new master. They see him as a geopolitical tool.
They see a weapon they can point at Tenochtitlan to finally destroy their Aztec oppressors.
Wow.
The Spanish provided a rallying point for all the fractured, resentful city-states that the Aztecs had abused for a century. When Cortés eventually marched on Tenochtitlan for the final siege, he didn't do it with just his surviving Spaniards.
Right, he had an army.
He marched with a coalition army of nearly 100,000 indigenous warriors. The conquest of Mexico was, in military terms, a massive indigenous rebellion led by a Spanish vanguard.
But the cultural shock of that initial collision in 1519 is just apocalyptic. Moctezuma II initially receives Cortés and Tenochtitlan with gifts. He houses them in a palace.
Which has debated motives.
Right, there is endless debate over why he let them in. Some sources say he was paralyzed by omens, believing Cortés was the returning god Quetzalcoatl, though many historians now believe that was a post-conquest invention to make Moctezuma look weak.
Very likely, yes.
Others argue he was trying to trap the Spanish inside the city to study them before executing them.
Regardless of his motives, it backfires spectacularly. Cortés executes a decapitation strike on the Aztec command structure. He takes Moctezuma hostage in his own palace.
Unbelievable.
By holding the Huey Tlatoani, the divine ruler whose word is absolute law, the Spanish effectively paralyzed the highly centralized Aztec state apparatus. The generals couldn't act without the emperor's orders.
And then the ultimate cultural disintegration shatters the fragile standoff.
Yeah, this is a dark moment.
Cortés leaves the city temporarily to deal with a rival Spanish expedition on the coast, leaving his volatile lieutenant, Pedro de Alvarado, in charge of the garrison in Tenochtitlan.
This leads to the Texcoco massacre.
It is one of the most horrific events in the codices. The Aztecs are celebrating the festival of Texcoco, honoring the god Tezcatlipoca and Huitzilopochtli.
A major religious event.
The elite young nobles, unarmed, are performing a sacred ritual dance in the enclosed courtyard of the Templo Mayor. Alvarado, claiming he feared an imminent uprising or perhaps acting out of sheer paranoia and greed for the gold they were wearing, orders his heavily armed men to block the exits.
And they slaughter the dancers.
They massacre the absolute cream of Aztec nobility. The codices describe the blood running like water, the severed hands of drummers. It was a complete desecration of their sacred space and a mass assassination of their leadership class.
It completely shattered any illusion of diplomacy. The city erupted in absolute fury.
As you would expect.
The paralyzed state apparatus woke up, and the Aztec population besieged the Spanish in the palace.
They bring Moctezuma out to the roof to try and calm the populace, but the people have lost all faith in him.
He's seen as a traitor.
He is struck by a stone likely thrown by his own people and dies shortly after. The Spanish are trapped, starving, and realize they have to break out. This leads to the night of June 30th, 1520, known to the Spanish as La Noche Triste, the Night of Sorrows.
The Spanish and their Tlaxcalan allies try to sneak out of the city in the dead of night, fleeing down the causeways that connect the island to the mainland.
But the Aztecs had removed the wooden bridges that span the gaps in the causeways.
It trapped them.
The Spanish tried to carry a portable wooden bridge with them, but it got stuck in the mud. The Aztec sentries spotted them, sounded the alarms, and thousands of warriors in canoes swarmed the causeways in the dark.
A nightmare scenario.
It was a chaotic, muddy slaughter. Hundreds of Spaniards and thousands of Tlaxcalans drowned in the lake, many of the Spanish weighed down by the stolen gold they refused to leave behind.
It was a massive tactical victory for the Aztecs. They were now led by Cuitlahuac, Moctezuma's brother, a seasoned general who had driven the invaders out.
They had won.
They had. But then the invisible weapon arrived.
The biological apocalypse. Smallpox.
The indigenous population of the Americas had zero acquired immunity to Old World pathogens. A single infected enslaved person in the Spanish ranks brought the virus, and it swept through the dense urban population of the Valley of Mexico like wildfire.
Our sources contain this haunting quote from Fray Bernardino de Sahagún, who compiled the indigenous accounts in the Florentine Codex.
Yeah, that quote is chilling.
The native survivors described the physical agony of the pustules, the inability to move. Sahagún wrote, "They died in heaps. In many places, it happened that everyone in a house died, and as it was impossible to bury the great number of dead, they pulled down the houses over them so that their homes became their tombs."
The demographic collapse is staggering to comprehend. Smallpox reduced the population of Tenochtitlan by an estimated 40 to 50% in a single year.
Half the city gone.
It killed the new emperor, Cuitlahuac, after just 80 days in power. It ravaged the military command structure, the priests, and the farmers. It fundamentally hollowed out the city's ability to resist, harvest food, or maintain the aqueducts.
This is where I look at the fall and see an unprecedented historical anomaly.
How so?
Well, the empire fell because it was hit by a technological, geopolitical, and biological black swan event simultaneously. I don't think any society on Earth could withstand a virgin soil smallpox epidemic and a massive coalition of steel-armed, resentful vassals at the exact same moment.
While I agree the disease was uniquely devastating and accelerated the timeline, I maintain that the empire was structurally doomed.
Doomed, anyway.
Yes, Moctezuma II had spent his reign making the system brittle. The hegemonic structure was a powder keg of indigenous resentment that the Triple Alliance had spent a century packing with gunpowder.
That's a good point.
They had built an empire entirely on extraction, terror, and the arrogance of supremacy. The Spanish simply provided the spark.
You think it was inevitable?
If it hadn't been Cortez, the Tlaxcalans and the Purépecha would have eventually found another fracture to exploit. An empire that offers its subjects nothing but the promise of violence has an expiration date.
That is a harsh but incredibly compelling point. By the time the final emperor, the young and defiant Cuauhtémoc, took charge, it was a doomed defense.
It was over.
Cortés retreated to Tlaxcala, recovered, and returned with his massive indigenous coalition. But he also brought an engineering marvel. He had his shipwright, Martin Lopez, build a fleet of 13 shallow draft brigantines.
Right, the boats.
They built them in Tlaxcala, dismantled them, carried the pieces over the mountains using thousands of porters, and reassembled them on the lake.
A logistical miracle that allowed the Spanish to control the water. They used the brigantines, armed with cannons, to destroy the Aztec war canoes and blockade the island, cutting off the city's food and fresh water supply.
They laid siege to Tenochtitlan for 93 days. Starved, dying of disease, drinking brackish water, and vastly outnumbered, the Aztecs held out in brutal, street-to-street fighting.
They didn't surrender easily.
No, they defended every temple, every canal. But on August 13th, 1521, Cuauhtémoc was captured in a canoe, trying to flee. Tenochtitlan fell. The magnificent monuments, the pyramids, the markets, they were sacked and destroyed, and from its ashes rose New Spain.
The speed of it all is what lingers with me. If we summarize this arc, it is whiplash-inducing.
It really is.
In barely 200 years, the Mexico went from exiled, ragged mercenaries eating marsh snakes in a swamp to the architects of a magnificent, wealthy, and ruthless empire, only to see completely dismantled by the very resentment their success relied upon.
It is the ultimate story of a rise and fall. But as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering thought.
What's that?
When you walk through the historic center of modern-day Mexico City, the Zócalo, you weren't just walking on the ruins of Tenochtitlan.
Yeah.
Look at the massive metropolitan cathedral that dominates the square. It was literally built using the dismantled, carved stones of the Aztec Templo Mayor.
It is the physical embodiment of the conquest.
Exactly. But it also means the empire didn't just vanish into thin air. It was physically and culturally pressed into the very foundation of the modern world.
That's a great way to look at it.
The Nahuatl language didn't die. It still lives, spoken by over 1 million people today. It gave the global vocabulary words like chocolate, avocado, chili, and coyote.
True.
The descendants of the Mexica and the Tlaxcalans are still there. The empire fell, the institutions collapsed, yes, but the people survived.
A powerful reminder that history doesn't end. It just builds on the rubble of what came before.
So the next time you see that flag with the eagle and the snake, you will know exactly what is buried beneath the cactus. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.